"I know this street. I built this street. Why won't it take me home?" The old man said it to no one, to the rain, to the shuttered fish stalls dripping under torn awnings. It was 11:10 on a Friday night in Mangwon Market when the sky opened without warning and swept the last vendors indoors, leaving him alone at the corner where the noodle cart used to stand, his cardigan soaked through, his hands empty of the phone he had left behind 3 hours earlier. Chidinma Okafor stood under the awning of a shuttered Banshan stall, off her second job of the day, her uniform bag heavy on her shoulder, watching him turn in a slow circle, like a man reading a map that kept rewriting itself. The sensible thing, the thing any nursing student 4 months from a visa renewal would do, was to flag a police box and walk away clean. What she did instead would walk her, soaked to the collar and holding a stranger's elbow, straight into the coldest boardroom in a company she had never heard of, and no one that night, least of all her, understood why the old man would not let go of her sleeve. Chidinma had been in Seoul 2 years, first as a language student living on ramyeon and borrowed textbooks, now as a third-year nursing student who filled the gaps between clinical rotations with private caregiving shifts nobody else wanted, the 11 to 7 overnight watch, the agency clients whose families lived abroad and paid on time and asked no questions. She had learned to read a room the way her professors taught her to read vitals, quickly, without judgment, cataloging what mattered before anyone spoke. The old man's hands were the first thing she noticed, trembling not from cold, but from the particular tremor of someone whose mind had slipped its mooring and could not find the dock again. She had seen it before, in a small house in Enugu, in a grandfather who once forgot her name for 11 days and then said it perfectly over breakfast as though nothing had happened. She had 400 won in coins, a phone at 9% battery, and a shift starting in 50 minutes on the other side of the river that she could not, under any policy the agency enforced, be late for twice in 1 month. She looked at the old man's soaked cardigan and did the arithmetic anyway. What Chidinma did not know, standing under a torn awning with a stranger's sleeve in her fist, was that the man beside her had once stood in front of parliament committees and foreign investors without blinking, that his signature had built 3 of the glass towers now glowing faintly through the rain toward the river, and that somewhere across the city a security team was combing 4 districts because Seo Hak-soo, founder and honorary chairman of the Dosan Group, had walked out of his own house at 8 in the evening and had not been seen since. To Chidinma, he was simply an old man who kept calling the shuttered noodle cart by a name that no longer matched the sign above it, who flinched from every stranger who tried to steer him by the shoulder, and who quieted, oddly, completely, the moment she stopped trying to steer him, and instead asked him what street he thought he was standing on. He answered her in a clear, courtly voice that belonged to a much younger decade. He did not know his own address. He knew, with total certainty, which direction was wrong. It would take her 90 minutes and most of the night to learn that trusting the second thing over the first was the only choice that worked. This is the story of the umbrella that never made it back to its owner, of a formal warning stapled into a caregiving file over a shift she never explained, and of a chief of staff who believed, not unreasonably, that any young foreigner who appears beside a fading billionaire is running the oldest con in Seoul. It is the story of a grandson so used to being lied to that kindness read to him as strategy, and who had to watch a stranger care for his grandfather with no one filming and nothing to gain before he understood the difference. It is the story of gochujang stirred into a goosey soup on a marble kitchen island, of hangul practiced in a shaking hand across the same page twice, of a boardroom where a young woman with a visa on the line chose the truth over the money on the table. And it is the story of a black umbrella, folded and forgotten in a hall closet for months, waiting for the one night it would be needed exactly where it had first been given away. In the rain, on the same market corner, at the start of everything that follows now. Every Friday for 6 months, without his driver knowing and without his grandson suspecting, Seo Hak-soo had taken a taxi to Mangwon Market and stood at the corner where a noodle cart had operated for 40 years before the pandemic closed it, run by a woman named Mrs. O who used to save him the last bowl of the night. Mrs. O was gone now, the stall replaced by a phone case kiosk, but something in his mind still walked him there every week like a compass needle finding north, insisting the world had not changed as much as everyone kept telling him. That evening the sky had been clear when he arrived at 7, and by 10 the clouds that swallowed the tower lights had emptied themselves in minutes, scattering the last shoppers under plastic sheeting. He had reached into his coat for the driver's number and found no phone, only a folded receipt and a set of keys to a house he could no longer picture from the outside. The rain did something specific to him that ordinary daylight did not. It erased the last 20 years first, then the 10 before that, until the market around him belonged to 1983, and he was a much younger man waiting for a bowl of noodles that no longer existed. Chidinma had spent the afternoon in a hospice ward changing dressings under a supervising nurse who corrected her Korean twice for every technique she praised, and the evening at a private apartment feeding rice porridge to a stroke patient whose daughter tipped her in exact coins and never a one more. She caught the last reasonable bus toward Mangwon with 11 minutes to change out of her scrubs before her overnight shift began across the river, her mind already rehearsing the handover notes she would need to give at 11. The rain caught her 2 blocks from the bus stop, and she ducked under the market's corrugated awning with a dozen other stranded people, checking her phone, doing the math on whether she could still make the crossing on time. It was the stillness that made her look up, not the old man's confusion, which the others around her were already dismissing with irritated glances, but his stillness inside it, the particular way he stood with his shoulders squared, as though addressing a room instead of a rain-soaked kiosk. She had seen that posture before, in Enugu, in a grandfather who forgot the year, but never forgot how to stand like a man used to being listened to. She stepped out from under the awning before she had decided to. By the time Chidinma reached him, 3 people had already tried and failed. A delivery driver in a rain poncho had gripped his arm to guide him toward a taxi stand and been shoved off with surprising strength. A young couple had offered their phone so he could call someone, and he had stared at the screen like an object from a language he had never learned, then thrust it back at them, offended. A market security guard, radio crackling, was keeping a bored procedural distance, waiting for a patrol car that was, according to the dispatch on his hip, 20 minutes out on a night when every officer in Mapo district was busy with flooded intersections. None of them were unkind, exactly. They were simply out of patience for a stranger who would not be helped in the way help was being offered. Chidinma stopped 4 feet away, out of his immediate space, and did not reach for him at all. She asked, in careful Korean, what street he thought he was on. He turned to her, the first person all night he had turned toward instead of away from, and answered with a street name that had not existed under that name in over a decade. She recognized the shape of the confusion before she recognized anything else about him. I know this street. I built this street. Why won't it take me home? He said again, quieter this time, less to Chidinma than to the rain itself, and something in the sentence, built, not walked, not lived on, snagged in her attention like a loose thread she could not leave alone. She thought, briefly and without letting herself finish the thought, of the office towers she passed on her commute, of how a man who talked about streets as things he had built did not belong in the same category as the drunk grandfathers her classmates joked about steering home from Norabang nights. She checked her phone. 9%. No umbrella of her own beyond the collapsible one in her bag. 43 minutes until her shift began on the far side of the river. The security guard's radio crackled again. The patrol car was now 30 minutes out, rerouted around a flooded underpass. She could wait with him and be officially, unambiguously late, or she could do what her training told her sundowning patients needed most: a calm voice, a familiar rhythm of questions, and forward motion toward anywhere resembling home. She opened her umbrella, held it over his head first, and her own second, and said the only thing that seemed to matter. "Which way did you used to walk home from work?" She tried the sensible half measure first. She called her agency's night dispatcher, a brisk woman named Miss Yang who managed 40 caregivers from a headset in an office that never closed, and explained in the clipped shorthand of someone watching her battery die that she had encountered an elderly man showing clear signs of disorientation and intended to see him safely home before her shift. And could someone please note that she might be 20, maybe 30 minutes late? Miss Yang's answer was not unkind, only procedural, delivered in the tone of someone who had heard 100 excuses shaped like good intentions. Policy required caregivers to report unauthorized deviations before the fact, not after, and unaccompanied elderly strangers were, categorically, not the agency's liability to assume on the client's behalf. Chidinma could hear, underneath the policy language, the shape of an actual warning. She said she understood. She did not hang up confident that she did. The security guard, radio still useless against the flooded roads, offered to walk them both to the police box 6 minutes away, then checked his own shift schedule and admitted, apologetically, that he could not leave his post unmanned during a weather emergency. It was 11:14. Her shift began in 46 minutes across a river that was, by then, visibly rising against its concrete banks. They walked slowly, because he could not walk any other way and because the streets he insisted on taking bore only a passing resemblance to the streets that actually existed. Twice he steered them confidently down alleys that dead-ended at construction fences, and both times Chidinma let him discover the wall himself before gently turning them both around, because she had learned in 3 years of clinical rotations that correcting a confused mind directly only deepened the fog, while walking beside it long enough usually let it correct itself. Her shoes, cheap canvas sneakers bought for a Korean autumn that had turned unexpectedly wet, were soaked through within 20 minutes, and the umbrella, angled entirely over his shoulders now, left her own hair plastered flat against her scalp and rain running in a steady line down the back of her collar. She texted her one still-living contact at the agency, a fellow caregiver named Precious who covered the neighboring district, asking her to flag the dispatcher that she was still in transit, still safe, still trying. Precious wrote back a single line that Chidinma read under a street lamp and did not answer. "They will dock you for this, you know that." Chidinma did know. She kept walking anyway, matching her pace to his uneven one. It was 1 in the morning by the time Chidinma finally understood, from a scrap of mail he produced with trembling relief from an inside coat pocket, which neighborhood they were meant to be walking toward, and nearly 2 by the time a taxi she flagged with her last working one delivered them both to a gated compound she had not known existed, behind an ordinary-looking hillside in a district she had only ever seen from a bus window. By then, her shift had been logged, automatically and without appeal, as an unexcused absence, the kind that under agency policy triggered both a written warning in her personnel file and a deduction equal to the full night's pay, regardless of the reason offered afterward. She would learn the exact wording 2 days later, standing in the agency's fluorescent-lit office, while a supervisor read it aloud in a voice that suggested this conversation happened often enough to have a script. Unauthorized deviation from assigned duties, first formal notice, wages withheld pending review. Chidinma did not argue the point that night or the day it was delivered. She had made the calculation once, standing under a torn market awning with a stranger's sleeve in her fist, and she did not believe in recalculating a decision after the fact, simply because the bill for it had finally arrived. The compound gate was manned at that hour by a single sleepy guard who nearly did not recognize the honorary chairman he had waved through 1,000 times, soaked and coatless and leaning on a stranger's arm at 2 in the morning. What followed happened fast and in a language half familiar to Chidinma, urgent Korean crackling over 2 different radios, house staff spilling out in bathrobes and untied shoes, a housekeeper named Mrs. Beck pressing both hands to her mouth at the sight of him, and then rounding, immediately, protectively, on Chidinma instead of on him. Where had she found him? How long had they walked? Why had no one called the house directly instead of wandering half of Mapo district with an 81-year-old man in a rainstorm? Chidinma answered every question as clearly as her exhausted Korean allowed, aware even as she spoke that the questions were not really requests for information but a kind of triage, the staff working out in real time whether she was a rescuer or a threat that had simply arrived a step ahead of its own plan. She was still holding her collapsed, dripping umbrella when a car she had not heard arrive pulled into the courtyard, headlights sweeping across the wet stone, and a man in a suit too precise for 2 in the morning stepped out already speaking. A fruit seller 2 stalls down, packing crates of rain-battered persimmons under a tarp, watched the whole exchange without fully understanding it and would, weeks later, be the one detail that mattered to an investigator asking questions about that night. She saw a young black woman in medical-looking scrubs crouch to the old man's eye level instead of looming over him, saw her point twice toward the tower lights across the river and shake her head both times, gently, as though declining a wrong answer without embarrassing the person who gave it. She saw the woman give up her only umbrella entirely, walking the first several blocks bareheaded in the downpour until the old man, noticing, tried clumsily to tilt it back toward her, and the 2 of them settled into an awkward, tilted compromise that covered neither of them completely and both of them partially. The fruit seller did not know the old man's name or his company or his fortune. She knew only that the girl had not once looked at her phone to check the time, had not once looked irritated, had knelt twice on wet pavement to retie a shoe that had come loose on a foot she did not own. It was, the fruit seller would say later, the kind of thing a daughter does, not the kind of thing a stranger does. She used a technique her clinical instructor had taught in a lecture on dementia care that Chidinma had once found almost too simple to trust. Instead of correcting the old man's confused geography, she asked him to describe it, in detail, and let the specificity of his own memory do the navigating. What color was the gate? Iron, black, with a stone lion on the left post that his late wife had always said looked more like a dog. Was there a hill? Yes, a steep one, and a persimmon tree just past the second bend that dropped fruit onto the road every autumn until the neighbors complained. None of it matched anything on a modern map, but each detail narrowed the search the way a fever narrows a diagnosis, and Chidinma found herself doing what she had done at 9 years old in Enugu, walking her own grandfather home from a market 3 miles further than he remembered it being, matching her stride to his, exactly so neither of them had to admit whose pace was actually being accommodated. The rain did not let up. Somewhere past the second hour, her feet had gone from cold to simply absent, a fact she noted clinically and set aside, the way she had been trained to set aside her own discomfort in the presence of someone else's crisis. Somewhere in the third hour, on a quiet residential street he did not recognize and she was navigating by instinct alone, Seo Haksu stopped walking entirely and turned to look at her properly for the first time, as though surfacing briefly from deep water. His eyes, for a moment, held none of the earlier confusion. "What is your name?" he asked, in the same clear, courtly voice he had used to declare which direction was wrong outside the market. She told him, Chidinma. He repeated it slowly, syllable by syllable, the way a man repeats a word in a language he is trying seriously to learn, rather than the way a man repeats something he expects to immediately forget. Then, before she could answer whatever question might follow, the clarity folded back in on itself like a tide pulling out, and he asked her, entirely reasonably, whether his wife knew he would be late for dinner. Chidinma did not correct him. She said his wife would understand, and asked him instead to describe the color of the front door, and he told her without hesitation that it was red, the only door on the street painted that particular shade of red because his wife had insisted no other color would do. It was, Chidinma would realize only later, exactly the right shade. Inside the gate, with Mrs. Bake fussing a blanket around the old man's shoulders and a junior staffer already on the phone to the family physician, Chidinma did not immediately leave, though every reasonable calculation told her she should already be running for a taxi back toward her abandoned shift. She stayed long enough to see him settled into a chair by the entry hall, long enough to explain to Mrs. Beck, in the specific vocabulary of her training, what sundowning was, what triggered it, what made it worse, and what the family should watch for if it happened again. Mrs. Bake listened with the particular attention of someone who had been managing this alone and frightened for longer than anyone in the house had admitted out loud. Only when a staff member finally noticed Chidinma's feet, bare of the shoes she had lost somewhere in the second hour, and bleeding faintly from a blister worn through by 3 hours of wet canvas, did anyone think to offer her a towel, a chair, a moment to simply stop moving. She refused the chair. She said she had somewhere to be, 4 hours late already, and reached for her ruined umbrella by the door just as the courtyard outside filled with a second set of headlights, faster and less patient than the first. The old man, still wrapped in his blanket, watched her reach for the door and did something that startled the staff into silence. He stood, unsteady, and crossed the hall to press something small and cold into her palm before she could step back. It was a ring, plain gold, worn thin on one side from what looked like decades on the same finger, and for a confused half-second, Chidinma thought he had mistaken her for someone else again, his wife perhaps, until he closed her fingers around it deliberately and said, with total lucidity, that no one had walked him anywhere in a long time without wanting something from him first. She tried to give it back. He refused, more firmly than his shaking hands suggested he was capable of, and Mrs. Beck, watching, made no move to intervene on either side. Chidinma set the ring on the entry table instead, where he could reach it again once he calmed, and told him, gently, that she had not walked him home for a ring, and that if he wanted to thank her properly, he could remember her name the next time someone asked him. It was, she would realize only in hindsight, the exact wrong thing to say to a man who was about to be accused, loudly, of having been taken advantage of. Seo Junho had spent the last 3 hours doing the math that every crisis forced him to do since he had taken over as chief executive 4 years earlier at 31, which disaster required his personal attention and which could be delegated, and whether the answer changed if the disaster involved his grandfather instead of a stock price. He had left a board dinner mid-course, driven himself through flooding intersections his own driver had refused to attempt, and arrived at the gate already braced for the worst version of the story, because in his experience, the worst version was usually correct. What he saw first was not relief. It was a stranger, soaked, foreign, standing barefoot in his grandfather's entry hall beside a ring he recognized instantly as his grandmother's, the one his grandfather kept in a locked drawer and had not, to Junho's knowledge, touched in 6 years. He had spent 4 years fielding calls from men and women who had befriended his grandfather at parks, at temples, at the same market corner he wandered to on Fridays, each of them eventually asking, with varying degrees of subtlety, for money, for investment, for a signature on something notarized. He did not see a caregiver who had walked a confused old man 3 hours through the rain. He saw the newest version of a pattern he had learned, at considerable cost, never to trust. "Who are you?" Junho said, not as a question so much as an accusation already halfway to a verdict. And before Chidinma could answer, he had crossed the hall and lifted his grandfather's ring from the entry table, turning it once between his fingers as though checking it for damage before he even looked at her again. She explained, as calmly as 3 straight hours of soaked exhaustion allowed, who she was, how she had found him, what she had done and why, and watched every sentence land against him like water against glass, visible, briefly, then gone without leaving a mark. He asked her name. She gave it. He asked which agency, which company, who had sent her, and when she said no one had sent her, that she had simply been standing under the market awning when his grandfather needed someone, his expression did something she would only later learn to recognize as the specific, practiced coldness of a man protecting something he could not afford to lose twice. "People do not walk strangers 3 hours through a storm for nothing," he said, in English now, precise and clipped, loud enough for the assembled staff to hear every word. "Tell me what you actually want, and we can finish this quickly." Mrs. Bake opened her mouth to intervene and was waved silent by a look Chidinma had not yet learned to read. Something in Chidinma went very still, the same stillness she used in hospital corridors when a doctor spoke over her as though her training were decorative. She did not raise her voice. She told him, in the clearest Korean she had, that she wanted nothing, that she had in fact already lost a night's pay, and very likely her clean disciplinary record for the privilege of standing in his hallway being accused of a crime she had not committed, and that if he wanted to check her story he was welcome to call the agency himself and ask why Chidinma Okafor had been marked absent at 11:15 that night. She said his grandfather's own words had gotten them both to this address. Not a phone, not a plan, nothing that resembled a scheme executed with any competence. For half a second something shifted behind Junho's eyes, a flicker of the doubt she had actually earned. Then a staff member, eager to diffuse the tension building in the hall, murmured something about calling security to see her out, and Junho, exhausted and unwilling to examine an instinct he had trusted for 4 years, did not correct him. Chidinma picked up her ruined umbrella from beside the door and walked back out into the rain she had just spent 3 hours inside of, this time completely alone. The bus that finally carried her home ran nearly empty at that hour, and Chidinma sat with her ruined shoes in a plastic bag on her lap and her bare feet propped against the cold metal rail, replaying the last exchange in the entry hall with the specific, unproductive clarity that exhaustion always brought her. She did not regret walking the old man home. She was surprised, turning the feeling over, to find that she did not even fully regret the missed shift or the warning waiting for her at the agency, both of which she could absorb, barely, without the whole month collapsing. What she could not shake was the accusation itself, the ease with which a stranger had looked at 3 hours of her exhaustion and mistaken it instantly for theft. She thought of her student visa, renewable in 4 months on a record that had, until tonight, been unblemished. She thought of her mother in Enugu, who had sold a parcel of land to send her here, and who would not understand, if it came to it, why her daughter had been dismissed from a house by a man in a suit for the crime of walking someone home. She did not yet know that the old man, alone in that hallway, was already refusing to go to bed until someone brought him back his ring, and said her name while he asked for it. Over the following 11 days, Seo Haksu left the house 4 times without permission, each escape more resourceful than the last. Once through a garden gate the groundskeeper had left unlatched for exactly the length of time it took to answer a phone call. Once by convincing a delivery driver that he was simply going to meet a friend nearby. Twice by a method staff never fully reconstructed, since he offered no explanation beyond insisting, each time he was found, that he had simply gone to see whether the girl was still waiting. He was always recovered at the same market corner, standing at the site of a noodle cart that had not existed in years, asking vendors who had never met her whether they had seen a young African woman in a blue uniform. Junho received each report by phone, in board meetings, in the middle of investor calls, and each time felt the specific, cold guilt of a man watching a decision he had made in anger produce consequences he had not budgeted for. He did not, at first, connect the escapes directly to the woman he had thrown out of his own entry hall. He told himself his grandfather was simply fixating, the way dementia sometimes fixated on an object or a place, and that the object this time happened to have a name. It was the family physician, a quiet, careful man named Dr. An, who had managed Seo Haksu's care for 6 years, who first pointed out the detail that unsettled Junho more than any of the 4 escapes combined. During a routine cognitive assessment, the old man could not reliably name the season, the current president, or the housekeeper who had worked for him for over a decade, sometimes calling Mrs. Beck by his late wife's name without noticing the substitution. But when Dr. An asked, almost as an afterthought, whether he remembered anyone new from recent weeks, Seo Hak-soo answered instantly and without hesitation, Chidinma. He gave her name correctly, twice, with the correct stress on the correct syllable, a level of precision he could not produce for words he had known for 80 years. Dr. An explained, gently, that this was not unusual and not, strictly speaking, sentimental. Memory and dementia often clung hardest to whoever had most recently made the patient feel safe, regardless of how briefly they had known each other. Jun-ho absorbed this in silence, turning it over the way he turned over a bad quarterly report, looking for the flaw in the data that would let him dismiss it. He did not find one. He asked, instead, for the agency's contact information. It took his assistant less than a day to confirm what a more careful version of Jun-ho might have checked before he ever raised his voice in the entry hall. The agency's overnight log showed Chidinma Okafor marked absent at 11:15 on the night in question, a formal warning issued, a night's wages withheld, no note of any prior incident in 2 years of otherwise spotless service across a dozen elderly clients, several of whose families had left written commendations praising, specifically, her patience with confusion and her refusal to rush a frightened person toward calm. There was no scam history, no prior complaint of the kind he had learned to expect, nothing that matched the pattern he had built his 4 years of vigilance around. Jun-ho sat with the file open on his phone for a long time in an otherwise empty office, doing something he rarely allowed himself, admitting a mistake in real time rather than after the fact, when it was easier to reframe. He did not call her. He told himself the practical matter, his grandfather's repeated escapes, was reason enough to act, and that whatever he owed her personally could wait until it stopped being urgent. It never occurred to him yet that the two things were not actually separate. When Jun-ho finally raised the subject with his grandfather directly, framing it carefully as a practical solution to a security problem rather than an apology he did not yet know how to give, Seo Hak-soo surprised him by being, for once, entirely lucid about what he wanted. He wanted the girl hired, properly, as a companion, paid fairly and treated as staff rather than as a suspect, and he delivered the demand with the exact tone Jun-ho remembered from boardrooms 20 years earlier, before the fog had started rolling in and out like weather. Han Ki-tae, the family's longtime chief of staff and legal counsel, sitting in on the conversation as he sat in on nearly all of them, raised the obvious objections in his usual measured voice. A stranger with no verified references beyond a caregiving agency, unfamiliar with the family, unfamiliar with the stakes of an upcoming shareholder vote that made any appearance of instability in the chairman's household dangerous. Seo Hak-soo listened to the entire objection without interrupting, then said, simply, that Han Ki-tae had managed the family's affairs for 20 years and still could not remember which direction his own office faced without a map, while the girl had walked him home through a flood without once asking where he was. The matter, as far as he was concerned, was closed. The offer reached Chidinma through the agency, reframed as a private placement request from a client family willing to pay nearly double her usual rate, and she very nearly declined it on principle before Miss Yang mentioned, almost in passing, which household was asking. She agreed on 2 conditions she stated plainly to the agency, and expected to be rejected: that the arrangement be documented properly this time, with hours and pay specified in writing, and that whoever had called her a thief in his own entry hall not be in the room when she started. The second condition, predictably, was not honored. Jun-ho was there on her first morning, standing at a careful distance in the kitchen doorway while Chidinma introduced herself to Mrs. Baek's rotation schedule and to Seo Hak-soo, who greeted her by name before she had finished saying it, as though continuing a conversation interrupted only briefly. Neither Chidinma nor Jun-ho acknowledged the entry hall directly that morning. He said stiffly that the household appreciated her flexibility, and she said, just as stiffly, that she appreciated being paid for it this time, and something about the exchange, brittle as it was, felt less like an apology than like 2 people agreeing to set a debt aside without either canceling it. It was Seo Haksu, not Chidinma, who first suggested the kitchen experiment, wandering into the marble-topped island one afternoon while she prepared a small pot of egusi soup from ground melon seeds she had specially ordered, a dish she made twice a month to keep some thread of Enugu alive, in a city that offered her almost nothing that tasted like home. He asked, with the frank curiosity of a man who had forgotten which century he sometimes occupied but never lost his appetite, what it was and whether it was any good. She let him taste a spoonful, braced for the polite grimace she had seen from Korean colleagues before, and watched instead as his eyebrows rose in genuine, delighted surprise. He disappeared and returned with a jar of gochujang from Mrs. Baek's pantry, insisting, with total conviction, that the two things belonged in the same bowl, and Chidinma, more out of affection than expectation, let him spoon a careful dollop into the simmering pot. It worked, in the accidental way good things sometimes did, the fermented heat of the gochujang deepening the melon seed's nuttiness into something neither cuisine had produced on its own. Mrs. Baek, passing through, tasted it and declared it the best thing to come out of that kitchen in a decade. Junho, arriving home to the smell, said nothing, but he ate 2 full bowls. The Hangul lessons started by accident, when Chidinma left a small notebook of practice characters on the sitting room table one evening, and Seo Haksu, waiting for his evening tea, picked it up and began correcting her strokes without being asked, his hand steadier on the page than it had been in months, as though the exact, structured shapes of the alphabet gave his fingers something solid to hold on to that conversation, no longer offered reliably. It became a nightly ritual neither of them named directly. She practiced her characters, he corrected them with real severity, and in exchange he let her teach him 3 or 4 words of Igbo, which he repeated back in a heavily accented but genuinely careful attempt that made her laugh out loud the first time and every time after. The go-stop cards came next, taught to her by Mrs. Baek on a rainy afternoon, and then claimed almost entirely by Seo Haksu, who played with a competitive sharpness that startled everyone in the house, winning 3 consecutive rounds against Chidinma with a triumphant, boyish delight that had nothing confused about it at all. Junho, passing the sitting room one night on his way to a call he did not take, stood in the hallway for a full minute watching his grandfather slap a winning card down and laugh, a sound he had not heard from that room in over a year. It was Chidinma's idea, born from a technique she had studied in a dementia care module and tested first, years earlier, on her own grandfather in Enugu, and she built it slowly over several weeks, rather than presenting it all at once. A plain photo album, purchased with her own money, before she thought to ask whether the household would reimburse her, filled page by page with printed photographs labeled in large, clear handwriting. Mrs. Baek, 17 years with the household, the garden gate, sticks sometimes, lift the latch twice. Junho, grandson, chief executive, calls every evening at 7 even when he does not come home. She left space on each page for Seo Haksu to add his own notes, and he did, in a shaking hand that grew steadier with practice, adding details no photograph could capture. The sound Mrs. Baek's slippers made on the hallway floor, the particular way his late wife had pinned her hair, the fact that his grandson had cried exactly once at his own father's funeral, and never again in front of anyone since. He showed Chidinma that last page without being asked, tapping it twice, and told her, with sudden and startling clarity, that someone should remember it even if he eventually could not, because the boy himself would never say it out loud to another living person. What Chidinma did not know, watching Junho stand rigid in doorways instead of joining the card games he clearly wanted to join, was that Seo Haksu had raised him almost entirely. From age 9, after a car accident on a rain-slicked coastal highway, took both of Junho's parents in the space of a single ordinary Tuesday. It was Seo Hak-soo who had sat through parent conferences he did not understand, who had learned, at 60, to braid nothing because there was no daughter to braid for, but who had shown up anyway to every school event with the wrong shoes and the right attention, who had once flown to Boston on 4 hours' notice because a 19-year-old Junho had called him drunk and directionless at 3 in the morning. The man, now forgetting which decade he occupied, was the only parent Junho had reliably had, and watching him ask a housekeeper for his dead wife twice in 1 week did something to Junho that 4 years of running a company through hostile takeovers and supply chain collapses had never managed. It made him feel, for the first time since he was 9 years old, entirely unequal to the situation in front of him. He did not know how to say any of this to anyone, least of all to the grandfather it was about, so instead he stood in doorways and said nothing at all. Han Ki-tae had served the Seo family for 22 years, first as junior counsel and now as chief of staff, and he approached the subject of Seo Hak-soo's declining capacity with the same careful, unhurried precision he brought to every contract he had ever drafted, which was precisely what made him difficult to argue against. He was not cruel. He was, if anything, visibly fond of the old man he had served for 2 decades, and he framed his position at a quiet meeting with Junho entirely in terms of protection rather than convenience. A shareholder vote was 6 weeks away, a vote the family needed to win decisively to fend off an activist investor circling the company's undervalued real estate holdings, and any public suggestion that the honorary chairman's mental state was unstable, whether raised by a rival or discovered by a journalist, could tank the family's negotiating position at precisely the moment it could least afford weakness. A formal declaration of diminished capacity, filed quietly now, on the family's own terms, with a court-appointed guardian and a well-regarded residential facility already selected, would remove the risk entirely and protect Seo Hak-soo from being used as a weapon against the company he had spent 60 years building. Junho listened to the entire argument and found, uncomfortably, that he could not identify a single point in it that was actually wrong. Han Ki-tae approached Chidinma directly on a Thursday afternoon while Seo Hak-soo napped, in the measured, courteous tone of a man who considered himself entirely reasonable, and asked whether she would be willing to provide a written account of the chairman's condition for the family's legal file. Nothing dishonest. He assured her twice, simply an emphasis on certain observations over others, the confusion rather than the clarity, the escapes rather than the go-stop victories, framed in a way that would support a transition already, he implied, effectively decided. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought and with the same even tone, that her current student visa sponsorship situation was, he understood, somewhat precarious, and that the family retained immigration counsel who assisted valued staff with exactly these kinds of complications, a benefit that could be extended informally in appreciation for her cooperation. Chidinma sat with the offer for a long moment before answering, aware of exactly what was being offered and exactly what it was meant to purchase. She told him, carefully, in the same clinical language she used with hospital supervisors who tried to shortcut a proper assessment, that she recorded what she observed accurately or she did not record it at all, and that if the family wanted a different answer they would need a different observer. Han Ki-tae thanked her for her time with unbothered, unhurried courtesy, and left. Han Ki-tae did not raise the matter with Chidinma again, which she understood, correctly, as a decision to route around her rather than a change of position. Within a week a family meeting had been scheduled, framed to the household as a routine care review but understood by everyone actually involved as the formal presentation of a guardianship petition, timed deliberately to close before the shareholder vote 6 weeks out. Chidinma learned the date from Mrs. Baek, who had learned it from a staff calendar she was not, strictly, supposed to share, and spent the following days doing the same arithmetic she had done once already under a market awning, except this time the variables were sharper. Her visa sponsorship, tied contractually to this household's goodwill, her wages, still the best she had ever earned, and the plain, uncomfortable fact that Han Ki-tae's plan was not obviously wrong, that a residential facility with round-the-clock trained staff was, on paper, a defensible answer to a genuine and worsening problem. What she kept returning to, lying awake in her small rented room with the memory notebook's blank remaining pages in her mind, was not the paperwork at all. It was the go-stop cards, the shaking hand growing steadier on Hangul strokes, the particular, specific dignity of a man allowed to still be himself in his own kitchen, and whether any of that survived a transfer to somewhere efficient and unfamiliar. In the days before the meeting, Junho began doing something he had not planned and could not fully explain to himself. He came home early, twice, 3 times, and stood unseen at the top of the stairs or just outside the sitting room door, watching Chidinma work when she believed no one of consequence was watching at all. He saw her correct his grandfather's Hangul stroke with genuine patience rather than performed cheerfulness, saw her lose 2 consecutive rounds of go-stop with visible, real frustration, rather than the careful, condescending losses hired help sometimes let elderly clients win. Saw her sit through a full hour of his grandfather calling her by his late wife's name, without once flinching or correcting him harder than necessary. None of it was for an audience, none of it, he was forced to admit, matched the profile he had built 4 years of vigilance around. He thought of Han Kitae's meeting, 6 days away now, and of the report the man had all but confirmed he intended to present with or without Chidinma's cooperation, built from selectively chosen observations rather than the full, complicated truth of what actually happened in that house every day. Junho did not yet know what he intended to do about any of it. He knew only that he no longer entirely trusted the version of the story he had been ready to believe 4 years running. The meeting convened in a conference room on the 14th floor of the Dosan Group's Seoul headquarters rather than in the house, a choice Chidinma understood immediately as deliberate, moving the conversation from a place where Seo Haksu was simply a grandfather to a place where he was, first and foremost, an asset requiring management. Han Kitae sat at the head of a long glass table with a folder in front of him thick enough to suggest weeks of preparation, flanked by 2 attorneys Chidinma had never met, and a physician whose name she recognized from a single brief consultation months earlier, not Dr. An, who had been quietly excluded from the proceedings for reasons no one explained aloud. Junho sat across from Han Kitae, unreadable, a stack of his own papers untouched in front of him. Seo Haksu himself sat at the far end, dressed with unusual care by Mrs. Baek that morning, present at Han Kitae's insistence that the subject of a guardianship petition be shown proper respect by attending his own hearing. Though everyone in the room understood, he grasped perhaps a third of what was actually being decided around him. Chidinma had been asked to attend as the household's primary caregiver, a role Han Kitae clearly expected would lend his conclusions credibility rather than complicate them. Han Kitae's presentation was, as expected, precise and largely accurate in its individual facts, and carefully arranged in its overall shape. 4 unauthorized departures from the residence in 6 weeks, documented confusion about basic orientation questions during 2 separate physician assessments, repeated instances of misidentifying close household staff, a pattern, he argued in the calm, reasonable voice he used for everything, consistent with a level of cognitive decline that made independent living, and by extension continued informal oversight of family business matters, an unacceptable risk both to Seo Haksu's safety and to the company's stability ahead of a contested shareholder vote. He then turned with practiced smoothness to Chidinma, introducing her as the chairman's primary daily caregiver and the person best positioned to confirm the pattern he had just described, before asking her directly, in front of the full room, whether she agreed that Seo Haksu's condition had measurably worsened over the past several weeks. It was, Chidinma understood immediately, not really a question. It was an invitation to provide the one piece of the presentation Han Kitae could not manufacture himself. A first-hand witness willing to say, on the record, that the version of events he had built was the only true one. Chidinma did not raise her voice, and she did not look at Junho or at the old man at the end of the table while she answered, because she had decided, sometime in the sleepless nights before the meeting, that the only version of the truth worth giving was the one that did not perform for anyone in the room. Yes, she said, Seo Haksu's memory had worsened in measurable ways over 6 weeks, and she would not minimize that for anyone's convenience, including his own. But his memory loss was selective and inconsistent in ways that mattered clinically. He had, in that same period, learned to correctly write 11 new Hangul characters, had won 4 consecutive rounds of Go Stop against household staff, and had contributed, unprompted and with full lucidity, detailed and accurate family history to a memory record she had helped him build, none of which was consistent with the uniform, irreversible collapse Han Ki-tae's presentation implied. She said she understood, plainly, that her own visa sponsorship and her employment in that house depended on this family's continued goodwill, and that she was aware her answer might cost her both. She said it anyway, because a clinical assessment built to justify a decision made in advance of the evidence was not an assessment she could put her name to, regardless of what it cost her. The room went very quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone has said something true that several people present had hoped would remain comfortably unsaid. Han Ki-tae's expression did not change, exactly, but something in his posture recalibrated, the courteous patience of a man adjusting his strategy in real time rather than abandoning it. He thanked Chidinma for her candor in a tone that made clear he considered it an obstacle rather than a contribution, and suggested, gently, that her assessment, while well-intentioned, reflected the limits of her training rather than the full clinical picture available to the family's own retained physician, whose written report, he reminded the table, already supported the guardianship petition, regardless of one caregiver's daily observations. One of the attorneys began reaching for a document to formalize the motion. Seo Haksu, at the far end of the table, had gone very still, watching the exchange with the specific, unreadable expression of a man who understood, in that particular moment with unusual clarity, exactly what was being decided about his life without his direct participation. Junho had not spoken once since the meeting began. Every person at the table, including Chidinma, was now waiting to see which side of the argument he intended to stand on when he finally did. Junho stood, finally, and the room's attention swung toward him with the reflexive speed of people who had spent years reading his silences for signal. He did not address Han Ki-tae first. He addressed his grandfather, directly, in a voice that shook slightly in a way none of them had heard from him in a boardroom before, and told him that he had spent the last 2 weeks watching, unseen, the way Chidinma cared for him when there was no meeting, no vote, no audience to perform for, and that what he had witnessed did not match the file in front of Han Ki-tae in a single meaningful respect. He turned to Han Ki-tae next and said, with the particular coldness he usually reserved for hostile negotiators rather than for a man who had served his family for 2 decades, that a report built by excluding Dr. An and by pressuring a caregiver to sign a predetermined conclusion was not a clinical assessment. It was a strategy document wearing a clinical assessment's clothes, and that he would not put the Seo family name on it, regardless of what it cost the shareholder vote. He said the vote could be won on the strength of the company's actual position. He would not win it by disappearing his own grandfather to do it. Han Ki-tae did not raise his own voice either, which was, in its way, the most telling thing in the room, and he did not immediately concede. He reminded Junho, with the same careful respect he had used throughout, that he had served 2 chairmen of this family with total loyalty for 22 years, and that his recommendation came from genuine concern for Seo Haksu's safety and the company's stability, not from any motive Junho should feel comfortable dismissing so completely. He was not wrong to worry, he said, that a company this size could not weather a public crisis of leadership confidence, and he asked, pointedly, whether Junho was prepared to personally guarantee that nothing like the 4 escapes of the past 6 weeks would happen again under whatever informal arrangement he was now proposing instead. It was a fair question, and everyone at the table, including Chidinma, understood it as one. Junho answered it directly rather than deflecting it. He was prepared to guarantee it, because he intended, starting that week, to restructure his own schedule and hire additional trained staff under Chidinma's clinical direction rather than under a facility's institutional one, and to personally answer for the outcome to the board himself if it failed. Han Ki-tae studied him for a long moment, then, finally, folded his hands and withdrew the motion. Chidinma did not fully register that the vote had gone in her favor until she was standing alone with Junho in the corridor outside the conference room several minutes later, the others having filed out first in the careful, deliberate silence of people recalibrating a relationship they had assumed was settled. He thanked her, awkwardly, in a voice that had clearly not had much practice at the sentence, for telling the truth even when it would have been easier and safer for her visa to simply agree with the version already written for her. She told him honestly that she had not done it to be thanked, and that she still expected, on some level, to be handed a termination notice by the end of the week, regardless of how the meeting had gone, because that had been, until 10 minutes ago, the pattern their entire acquaintance had followed. Something in his expression shifted at that, not quite a smile but its careful, unpracticed cousin, and he said that he owed her an apology considerably older than 10 minutes. Going back to a rain-soaked entry hall and a ring he had lifted off a table without asking a single honest question first. She said she remembered. He said he had thought about very little else in the 6 weeks since. In the weeks that followed, Junho did something none of the household staff had seen him do in the 4 years since he had taken over the company. He came home before 9 most evenings, sat in on at least one Hangul lesson a week without pretending it was accidental, and asked Chidinma direct, specific questions about his grandfather's care, rather than delegating the entire subject to a file he reviewed once a month. He was, by his own admission, bad at it at first. Too formal with a man he loved fiercely and had never learned to be simply present with, hovering at the edge of go-stop games rather than joining them and asking clinical questions about sundowning triggers in the exact clipped tone he used for supply chain reports. Chidinma corrected him the way she corrected anyone, without softening it for his title, telling him once, directly, that his grandfather did not need a chief executive managing his decline. He needed a grandson willing to sit on the floor and lose at cards on purpose sometimes. Junho lost the next 3 rounds so badly that even Mrs. Beck, watching from the doorway, laughed out loud, and Seo Haksu, delighted and utterly unaware he was being humored, declared it the best week he had had in as long as he could remember. Six months carried the household through a rhythm that Dr. An, reinstated as primary physician the week after the boardroom meeting, described honestly to anyone who asked. Seo Haksu's condition had not reversed, would not reverse, and on difficult days he still forgot the year, the season, occasionally the name of the company he had built from a single import license into a conglomerate spanning 3 industries. But the good days had become more frequent and more fully inhabited. Filled with go-stop victories and Hangul pages and a growing shelf of memory notebooks, Chidinma helped him fill one detail at a time, and even the difficult days had grown gentler, met now with patience rather than panic, from a household that finally understood what it was managing. Chidinma's position had been formalized properly this time, in writing, with wages that reflected her training rather than a stranger's guilt, and Junho had connected her, without conditions attached this time, and without expecting anything in return, with Immigration Counsel who helped her transition from a student visa toward a stable working sponsorship tied to her actual qualifications rather than to any single household's continued goodwill. She had not asked for the help. She had, this time, let herself accept it, because it was offered without a price attached. It happened slowly enough that neither of them could later name the exact evening it stopped being professional courtesy and became something else. though Mrs. Beck claimed she had known before either of them, watching Junho linger in the kitchen doorway long after his grandfather had gone to bed, ostensibly reviewing documents on his phone while Chidinma finished the evening's dishes. He told her once, on one of those late evenings, that he had spent 4 years building careful distance between himself and anyone who approached his grandfather, and that watching her dismantle that instinct, without ever once asking him to, had frightened him more than any hostile takeover he had navigated. She told him in turn about her own grandfather in Enugu, about the 11 days he had forgotten her name, and the perfect breakfast morning he had said it again, and about how she had spent years afterward believing that loving someone through forgetting was the loneliest kind of love there was, until she had watched Junho learn to sit on his own sitting room floor and lose at cards on purpose. Neither of them said anything larger than that evening. They did not need to. The distance between the kitchen doorway and the sink had already closed by several careful inches, and neither of them stepped back. It was Seo Haksu, rummaging through a hall closet on a clear afternoon in search of a coat he insisted he needed despite the sunshine outside, who produced the object that closed the story properly, a black umbrella, unremarkable, slightly bent at one rib, that Mrs. Bake recognized immediately, and Chidinma did not recognize at all until she saw the small tear near its edge, the same tear it had carried the night she gave it away entirely to a stranger's shoulders instead of her own. He had kept it, deliberately, in a hall closet for the better part of a year, refusing every offer from staff to discard the shabby thing, and when Chidinma asked him, gently, why, he answered with the same clear, courtly certainty he brought to his best days. He said a person did not throw away the only object that had ever been given to him with nothing expected in return. Han Ki-tae, present that afternoon on a visit that had become, in the month since the boardroom, something closer to genuine friendship than institutional obligation, admitted quietly to Junho that he had been wrong about her from the beginning, and that he was, for what it was worth, glad to have been wrong. Junho took the umbrella from his grandfather's hands and said nothing, turning it over once, already knowing exactly where it belonged. The rain came back to Mangwon Market on an ordinary Friday evening almost exactly a year after the first storm, and this time Chidinma was not walking home from a second shift with a dying phone battery. She was simply walking, unhurried, beside a man who had rearranged an entire company's calendar to be there with her. Junho opened the same black umbrella, ribs still faintly bent, and held it over her shoulders first this time, the way she had once held it over a stranger's, angling it so completely toward her that he took the worse half of the downpour without seeming to notice or mind. They stopped at the corner where a phone case kiosk stood, where a noodle cart used to be, the spot Seo Haksu had returned to 4 times in a single season searching for a girl who had, in the end, never really left. Junho did not say anything large or rehearsed. He asked her, instead, the same question she had once asked his grandfather under this same torn awning, in the same careful voice, which way she wanted to walk home tonight. Chidinma looked at him for a long moment, rain falling steadily around the small dry circle they stood inside together, and did not answer with a direction at all. She reached for his free hand instead, and they walked.